Well, no, Joe, go right ahead and get going. I'm looking for. I've read through it, but go for it.
Can you all hear me okay?
You could speak up a little. It's a little hard to hear you, but
Sorry, is this
good.
better?
Excellent.
Perfect.
Great, okay. Let me just get that out of the way. All right, video can be a highly effective tool for the dissemination of or introduction to information. And while tech advances across the educational world, we are stuck. The educational world make the ability to create video by novice producers more and more widely available. Traditional means like camera capture and edit still exist, and the methodology now includes an entire video production suite in one's pocket. Almost anyone can create and share video directly from their smartphone. And even if they couldn't, on our campus, we make consumer cameras and the means by which to edit the video shot on them widely available. At Geneseo, we've introduced a small lab where members of the campus community can make use of screen capturing software in a sound-resistant room on a powerful computer with quality audio recording capabilities. Anyone interested in taking the time to do so is welcome to use the lab to create their own Khan Academy-style videos. And furthermore, installations like the One Button Studio created by Penn State and replicated on campuses across America aren't just cleverly named bits of technology. Novice video producers can now shoot high-quality video with nothing more than the press of literally a single button. But even with the introduction of these technological advances, limited time and resources make it difficult to help these novice producers create effective video. And effective video, for the purposes of this project, are defined as videos that deliver the intended message without overwhelming the cognitive resources of the viewers. The heart of this management of cognitive resources is the cognitive load theory, the theory of how much mental resources need to be applied to acquire information. And it's composed primarily of three parts: intrinsic cognitive load, which refers to the inherent level of difficulty and amount of interplay between concepts being studied, or element interactivity. The less element interactivity between concepts, the less impact on cognitive load. The more complex the task being studied, the higher the effective impact on cognitive load. There's extraneous cognitive load, which refers to the unnecessary additional demands placed on the limited cognitive resources of the learner due to choices made in the presentation of material. Energy expended in processing extraneous cognitive loads are energies diverted from processing intrinsic or germane cognitive loads, and thus need to be avoided as much as possible. Impact on cognitive load is additive, so minimizing extraneous cognitive load is generally most desirable, which leads us to germane cognitive load. Whereas extraneous cognitive load is to be limited wherever possible, germane load is to be promoted, as its goal is to direct learners' attention to relevant schemas. That's to say, mental effort expended on realizing how the various schemas fit together. These three areas of cognitive load can be managed through the appropriate application of good design in such a fashion that the material being presented doesn't overwhelm an individual's cognitive resources, which is where Richard Mayer's 12 Principles of Multimedia Learning come in. Through the use of these 12 tools, I reviewed a sample of videos created on our campus by video producers who had little or no understanding of cognitive load theory or direct exposure to the principles of multimedia design. By considering the principles in three categories, we can see how they can be used to reduce extraneous load, manage intrinsic load, and increase active cognitive resources. For example, extraneous cognitive load can be reduced through the use of the redundancy principle, a principle that says people learn better through graphics and narration than from graphics, narration, and on-screen text. The appropriate use of the coherence principle, which states people learn better when extraneous words, pictures, and sounds are excluded rather than included. The signaling principle that states that people learn better when cues that highlight the organization of the essential material are added. Spatial contiguity, which states that people learn better when corresponding words and pictures are presented near rather than far from each other on a page or screen. And temporal contiguity, which states that people learn better when corresponding words and pictures are presented simultaneously rather than successively. Now, these principles, when used properly, reduce the impact of extraneous load incurred by poor design by reducing split attention and potential overload on a single channel of information processing. Intrinsic cognitive load can be managed through the use of multimedia principle, which states that people learn better from words and pictures than just from words alone. This segmenting principle that states people learn better from a multimedia lesson if it's presented in a user-paced segments rather than one continuous unit. The pre-training principle, which states that people learn better from multimedia lessons when you know the names and characteristics of the main concepts in advance. And the modality principle that indicates that people learn better from graphics and narrations than from animation and on-screen text. And these principles, when used properly, reduce the impact of intrinsic load by assuring that large amounts of difficult information are broken down into manageable bits and processed both visually and orally. We can increase active cognitive processing through application of the personalization principle that states people learn better from a multimedia lesson when the words are delivered in a conversational style rather than a formal style. And the voice principle is implemented, which states that people learn better when the narration in a multimedia lesson is spoken in a friendly human voice rather than a machine. And the image principle, which actually states people do not necessarily learn better from a multimedia lesson when the speaker's image is added to the screen. These social principles, when applied, provide an increase to the viewer's active cognitive resources, which is essentially social scientists speak for increased engagement. The notion of reviewing these videos for effectiveness began as a thought experiment intended to help me better support the campus community in their endeavors to create video in the future. And it seemed appropriate to begin by considering what the samples of video showed the producers intuitively understood and where they failed to apply good design. As such, I developed a very simple rubric intended to assist in the adjudicating of how well each of the principles have been applied. A 0 to 4 scale, Likert scale, intended to be applied to each of the individual principles as they related to each of the videos being reviewed. Initially, I'd considered an average or cumulative score to determine overall quality of application of principles. But after discussions with Dr. Snyder and Stam, I abandoned this notion and decided to list that a list of discrete scores would be more appropriate. And in the end, each of the scores for each of the principles is intended to be considered on their own. As Mayer himself contests, his principles are not binding laws. And it's in the same light of consideration that one should view these scores. The results of the rubric are more of a guide for considerations of how well the principle is being made use of. Given the number of principles being applied to each of the videos and the extended duration of some of the videos, I found my own cognitive resources being taxed during the process. And as such, I created guiding questions to be asked of oneself throughout the application of the rubric. This helped keep me on task, but it didn't alleviate the amount of time and effort spent scoring each of the videos. Admittedly, I was scoring more videos than the novice video producer probably would be, but some of them were taxing and overly tedious. Not a task I suspect most casual video producers would be interested in ever doing twice. It was also obvious from the outset that the application of a simple Likert scale to each principle wouldn't tell me much about the videos themselves. So each of the video scores were tabulated in conjunction with a series of notes tied to a time code for each video explaining how one element or another affected the decision to apply the score that was generated. The general notes portion of the score sheet tied together existing notes or gestalt concepts that failed to appear in single noted locations. And it was at this point in my information gathering that I still didn't feel I had much more than small silos of information that really failed to show much interplay among them. And as a continuation of the thought experiment, the notion of crafting 12 short essays, one for each of Mayer's principles, explaining each of how the principles in terms of how they relate to cognitive load theory, how the samples of videos generated for Geneseo made or failed to make use of the principles in interesting and exciting ways, and finally, how the principles tied into one or more of the other principles. And the crafting of these essays brought to light some interesting notions regarding the application of the principles across the samples. For instance, in my opinion, the most interesting use of a principle was the application of a table to directly compare ASL vocabulary videos making use of manual cues to those not making use of manual cues. Laying out the videos in a table meant that the same message could be displayed in two different forms side by side, so viewers could make direct comparisons without suffering a split attention or the effects of searching within a web page in which the information was delivered. This attention to spatial contiguity as it relates to the video's locations was an interesting extension of a principle normally considered for use within the design of video. And furthermore, it was a simple solution that required no additional technological know-how on behalf of the professor making the page. He just understood inherently that forcing students to split their attention across the page would reduce the impact of the comparisons he was attempting to make. And this is the sort of understanding I was looking for. So, all right, I was, well, I'm a bit of a pedagogy nerd, and me found some sort of perverse enjoyment in sifting through these questionable videos while tinkering with methodology for reviewing said videos. I knew that pretty much no one else would want to do this. The application of a rubric, guiding questions or not, to make comparisons among videos simply to determine whether or not one had applied some design principles that would hopefully help the reduction of cognitive load for viewers just isn't the sort of thing people are likely to do, especially novice video producers. Video production can be tricky enough. Adding a further layer of complexity would assure a loss of interest. And it was at this point that Dr. Kahn suggested the introduction of visuals. From here, I set out to create 5 infographics. And for the sake of full disclosure, it seems important to acknowledge at this point that while I enjoy creating visuals, I'm no artist, and my visuals reflect that. I employed simple iconography to establish a theme, and I carried that through the five infographics. As presented, the first infographic here is intended to be a bit of pre-training to introduce the principles to the viewer. And the second visual explanation of cognitive load and the impact design can have on it. And the third, how the social principles can elevate cognitive capacity. The fourth, how application of good design can decrease intrinsic cognitive load. And finally, the fifth, how bad design increases extraneous cognitive load. The primer could be used as an introduction or an introductory reference to the principles and cognitive load theory, and hopefully provide a base of understanding that would be applied to video production. However, those hopes alone weren't anything I was willing to rest my hat on. The infographics do not walk the video producer in any way through the steps I took to evaluate video and come to conclusions regarding the efficacy of video. And as previously mentioned, I don't expect anyone should want to have to make the same amount of effort to review the videos the way I did. And for this reason, I created a corresponding checklist to be consulted to help determine whether or not one has applied principles appropriately. For the purposes of the checklist, I decided on a print layout to be offered as a handout marked upon, as opposed to creating an online survey that could compete with desktop space and require flipping back and forth between videos and browsers. I've modified the guiding questions I used when applying the rubric to align with the use of the social principles, more easily obtained when the language is used is less formal. I've chunked the principles by intended accomplishment, reducing extraneous load, managing intrinsic load, and increasing cognitive capacity. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, I've removed the Likert scale and replaced it with a binary checklist. With so much already going on in this sheet, it seemed too egregious a violation of the cognitive load theory to ask the reviewer to then muddle through the process of determining a ranked score for each of the principles involved. Now, the consideration of the 12 principles of multimedia learning are just one consideration to be considered when making video. It is completely possible to follow all of the design principles and create a video that manages cognitive load, and yet still fails to be an effective video for one or another reason. For instance, the introduction of an on-screen text within a sign language vocabulary video could be used to reinforce the connection between the word and the sign. However, as pointed out to me by our ASL instructor, the direct connection between words and signs is considered by some members of the deaf community to be offensive. And as a designer, this isn't something I would have known and would have created this social faux pas. Additionally, varying degrees of application of the principles were displayed by novice video producers without any exposure to the principles. In some cases, I wondered if the violations introduced were due to a lack of technical proficiency. Introduction of unnecessary bits of silence where the video producer failed to edit out portions of the video, for example, or failures of contiguity where the audio recorded could have been cut and played back over a corresponding bit of video, Or finally, the student group, for instance, that failed to introduce on-screen images that could have reinforced their demonstration in a multimedia presentation. In some instances, technical understanding was employed to overcome issues that seemed to be understood innately by the producer. For instance, where spatial contiguity was a problem, the novice math professor video producer thought to make use of on-screen annotations to direct attention to the viewer, the attention of the viewer to the appropriate locations on the screen, and thus reducing split attention issues. From what I learned during the time spent on this project, I'd be interested in seeing further research done on the long-term benefits of the introduction of video into the ASL courses. Over time, were students better able to recall vocabulary terms for words introduced via video than other means? Is there a correlation between video production proficiency and the adherence to the 12 principles? And that's to say, do video producers inherently navigate their way towards adherence to the principles as they develop proficiency in video production? And finally, does the use of effective video produce greater gains in learners in some fields than others? Do STEM students, for instance, benefit more from the use of video within STEM fields than, say, English literature students? And that's where I am.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. You really worked hard on this. It's really amazing what you've done here, and I really appreciate it. I will, there are some minor things like the table of contents is hard to read because it's hard to connect the headings to the page numbers. I can show you how to fix that, but also, I don't know if anyone else in the history of this program has done a 178-page thesis, although I know that a lot of this was, or some of it anyway, was a review that you did of those videos.
There's a lot that could probably be put into appendix there, like the notes and things like that. As for the table of contents, you're right. I probably it's an automated table of contents, and I probably could have selected a different style from the.
Yeah, something with ellipses with dots so I can see, because it's hard to tell. That's not a big issue, but it really is nice the work you did. Those infographics, did you include all those infographics in the thesis?
There should be.
Okay, because
there should. You know what? I'm not sure. I'm not sure what version you saw. They may have also been appendix.
Oh, okay.
I thought I shared those with you via email, though. If you don't,
I saw them.
They're in the zip file, I think.
Oh, okay. It's just that I would normally like to see them in the thesis itself.
I think they're in my version of the thesis that I printed.
Really? Okay.
So they're in there somewhere at the end.
That's all I was asking. Yeah, maybe this is something you fixed too. The abstract should go before the table of contents, but.
I did not fix that. No, I wasn't exactly sure where that should be, and I will adjust that in the final version.
Yeah, I could send you the book for laying out the thesis. I think you've got it pretty close. But
Steve, you linked that in the Tiddly Wiki, didn't you?
I believe so. But I think the ordering is pretty standard in every other thesis you've ever seen. So, yeah. Abstract acknowledgement, table of contents.
Yeah, yes, that's. I thought you did a real good job on cognitive load. I think I understood it a lot better than I have in the past, so I appreciated that. And I know you worked hard. I'm not wild about a yes/no answer on the checklist, but I know you thought about that. I just think that a lot of it's a maybe. It's sort of like. They did include some things, but not a lot. Like maybe there were icons or there's a sound and imagery, and others there isn't. You know what I mean? But I understand you're just trying to get people through it.
Yeah, that decision to bring that down to a binary decision was a tough call to make. It was really something I spent a long time on thinking about. How can I get people just to consider these principles when they're making video? And in a vacuum, that hard yes/no answer, whether or not there is a maybe involved, could be difficult, and probably something that would be better represented by perhaps a maybe column, but at least, as long as they're thinking about it, then hopefully they'll consider the use of it. There was one video in particular where the students did a great job doing this kind of a hokey little presentation that was intended to be very low tech, but I thought would have been much more enhanced by the introduction of a couple of multimedia graphics. And perhaps having seen this checklist, they would have thought, oh, you know what, maybe we could do that. We could just make a PowerPoint, export it as a JPEG, throw it up on the screen. But yeah, I understand where you're coming from, and it was a decision I had grappled with myself.
Okay, I mean, I know, and that's okay. It's a very complex issue, each one of these, and you're boiling it down to a yes or no. But that's fine. I think that was about it. Steve, did you have any issues?
I would, or Ryan, I think you were in there.
That's right. It was video. Yeah.
Yeah. No. I think that. I mean, geez, 178 pages. That's 20 pages off my doctoral dissertation. So it's.
So it's still short.
Yeah.
No. Well. Yeah. Aspirational goals, I guess. Yeah. No. I think this is a really rigorous. Look at the effort, like Dr. Kahn said, everything from cognitive load to the history of this sort of thing was really nicely laid out. So I was incredibly impressed here. And I mean, at the proposal level, it was already pretty substantive. So it's nice to see that it deepened even further.
Joe, I just have one suggestion. It's a very sort of picky thing. Well, two things actually. I think on your table of contents, you'd probably be fine taking it to 2 levels and not having the 3rd level visible.
That actually was a change I made in a draft you haven't seen yet.
Okay, good. It's just, I don't think, okay, then. And then I think the section on essays, when we originally talked about essays, in my mind, I was thinking of them as sort of like a standalone, sort of like the 3 previous ones. You'd have a standalone version of the essays. But the way you've done it is it's more of like a discussion section. So I think you don't need to call them essays anymore exactly. They're just discussion of the principles or something like that. It's a pretty minor thing, but I think, it kind of interrupts the flow and then to call them essays and calls them out. So I would just change that word essays to discussion of principle or something like that.
Okay.
Because I think then you'd see all those principles, and I don't know, you'll come up with the right heading. I think essays at this point isn't quite right.
Okay.
And that's like I said. And then don't forget. I know you've probably gone on and done it. It looks like you're all lined up to do the table of contents for the list of figures and stuff. So you just have to finish that out, right?
Did the list of figures in the copy you have, is there a table of contents and then a list of figures? Yeah. Integrating the two wasn't something I was really able to do with the style format I was using.
Oh yeah, you sort of basically need page numbers in that list.
Okay, then you got the draft where I omitted the page numbers from the figures because something had happened where it was
okay. But anyway, just so you've got it, yeah. Okay, that's all my yeah, and then we'll take a look at the final thing. So
yeah, I'll send you some comments. The one thing I would say you need to do is cut the abstract to about half of what it is. You don't really need all that sort of mental discussion, like I will review my findings in the form of. Just say, included are 12 essays, cognitive load theory, and infographics. You don't need the mental sort of essay kind of writing.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Because it's running 2 pages, and an abstract should be, about maybe half to 2/3 of a page.
Originally, the abstract wasn't that long, but after we received the style guides we were given, it had suggested that we needed to provide a description of all the videos referenced, and that really kind of brought out the length of that abstract a bit.
Yeah, I think, Russ, I kind of dug up, there's some new thinking about the use of abstracts in the digital age that I've come up. So we circulated a slightly different version, but however you want to do it, Joe, it's pretty much.
Well, I kind of agree with Russ. I mean, he's absolutely right.
Go with Russ's view. I can see where, I get it, and that would be fine too. But there's no word limits, and that was really what the point was.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they're also using abstracts in a slightly different format in the way that we're going to use a README file. So we've already got your README file to do that work.
Okay.
With
Okay.
all your videos and stuff. So yeah, thank you.
Well, yeah, it's just the writing style. Say
Yep.
I will be including a series of infographics. That's not necessary.
Yep.
Just the infographic. But okay.
Thank you, everybody. That was a really nice round of projects, and it was